Hi, my name's Alyson Norman. I'm Associate Professor in the School of Psychology at the University of Plymouth. I've been researching head injuries, brain injuries more generally for well, the best part of 20 years. Most of my research is looking at the social impact, or the long-term impact of head injuries. So that includes things like access to community care, but also things like socialization and the psychological impact for both individuals but also family members as well. The most recent paper that we've had published was called The Perfect Storm. And the idea is it's looking at community neurorehabilitation and how that's been affected by this so-called UK crisis. So to put it into context, the problem started back with Brexit, and it meant that as a result of the upcoming Brexit situation, a lot of people who were coming from EU countries decided to return home. And then that got worse when Brexit was actually introduced. On top of that, there's also been a problem around COVID, which meant that a lot of people were unable to work, which also led long term to people leaving the care sector. So what we see across the board, not just within community neuro rehab, is that there's a huge shortage of staff within the care sector. That's actually far worse for neuro rehabilitation because we need very well trained support workers. Individuals who have brain injuries quite often have very complex needs, and therefore support workers need to be very well trained. So having a high turnover of staff, and quite often staff coming from other international countries where there may be language barriers, but also perhaps less training, that can really create a problem for accessing the decent support staff that we need. What we're seeing is because of this lack of support worker, access to support workers for people with brain injury, what they're receiving on the ground is very limited support with daily living. So individuals quite often have physical disabilities, but actually some of the most prominent needs that they have are around helping them to get out and about or helping them to plan and live their lives accordingly. And quite often that sort of support isn't seen as being so crucial. So where there's limited staff, what we're seeing is that that's falling by the wayside. People may not be able to get out so much. So we're seeing an increase in social isolation and loneliness. So reductions in quality of life of our individuals with brain injury, which in turn then puts a huge care burden on families who have to pick up that support. The lack of support does lead to a huge impact upon families. So what we see is that families are increasingly being asked to pick up hours of support, which normally would have been provided by care workers. This has impacts in terms of family members' ability to work, for example. So they may end up in a situation where they're having to give up either full-time employment or give up working completely because they're having to care for their loved ones. We're also seeing an increase in the rate of burnout amongst family members who are struggling to have their own personal needs met because they're too busy looking after their individuals who have brain injuries. And ultimately, this has potential safeguarding implications as well. So if individuals are in high stress environments where they're looking after their loved ones around the clock, we know that that can lead to things like abuse, unfortunately, taking place within homes. So I think in terms of policy, one of the key things that is needed is a review of our current immigration policy. So there's been a huge push, as we know, over the last several years to reduce immigration. But the reality is that we're not seeing enough UK-based staff wanting to take up the role of support work. So in the short term, actually we need to be engaging in better systems that allow people from EU countries to come and work in support worker roles in the UK. But I think longer term, we actually need to address what the role of a support worker is. So I think one of the reasons that we don't have many UK-based individuals wanting to take up those sorts of roles is because they're traditionally very poorly paid. There isn't usually a career progression for individuals who work in support work. There aren't many incentives, and it isn't looked upon as being a particularly prestigious career. Whereas actually the reality is that they serve an important purpose in terms of supporting some of our most vulnerable people in our society. So there needs to be a move towards raising the profile of those kinds of roles and actually being treated as a profession in their own right. To an extent, the way we help to improve the impression, if you like, of support work is through better pay packages, through better incentives generally. But I think it's also looking at how we structure the profession more widely. So particularly during COVID, due to high levels of sickness and staff turnover, what we saw is a lot of people leaving the industry completely to go and take up things like retail posts, partly because they were getting paid more, but also because they weren't being put under so much stress. So we need better working conditions for individuals. But as I said, part of it is about helping to see it as a profession. So potentially having more formalized training processes with scaled rates of pay so that people feel like they're actually working towards a career goal rather than stuck in a job that potentially doesn't have any progression associated with it. In terms of future research, I think one of the first things that we need to be doing is having a look at what some of the organisations that work with, particularly within brain injury case management, are doing to retain staff. So there are areas of good practice where we see companies being able to maintain support workers over a long period of time. And this does seem to be through extensive training packages and scaled pay schemes. But actually what we need is probably some research to look at how that differs from other companies that perhaps are not employing similar techniques to see whether it is as effective as we think it is, and learn some best practice from those research studies. I think my final point really is considering that large family impact, but also the safeguarding issue around brain injury. So in terms of people who have brain injury more generally, we see that they're some of the most vulnerable individuals within our society. They're already highly represented within homelessness. Up to about 50% of people who are homeless have had brain injuries. We see similar statistics amongst mental health. 30% are likely to experience suicidality and substance misuse, hugely represented within prisons. And actually the one thing that's keeping individuals from deteriorating and ending up in those sorts of situations is support workers. And without them, it is ultimately the family that bears the brunt of that. So we have a situation here where without these sorts of support, we're massively impacting on the safeguarding of these individuals, but also on the well-being of family members.